Today I'll be talking about the tracking of Old Car off of Family Company's Contributions EP, which came out in May 2022. In this particular session, the band wrote 4 songs from top to bottom in just under 4 hours. I thought I'd take you behind the scenes and show you a typical tracking day at my studio and hopefully share some helpful tips on how to capture a great band recording. Everything you'll be hearing in this video is the raw audio as it was recorded the day of. The studio footage is the actual performance captured in one take. You'll find the link to the finished video with the mixed and mastered audio in the description below. Stay tuned for the full mixing process in a later video. For now, let's dive into the recording. A proper room setup is usually the most overlooked part of the recording process and the biggest reason behind poor sounding recordings. How you set up a room and the microphones you choose can make all the difference in the world when it comes to isolation and eliminating phase issues. It's important to experiment with your room and find a setup that works for your space and your workflow. But remember, music is a conversation, and communication is crucial to the creative process. I've tried to not only place everyone where they can sound best for the recording, but also where they can clearly communicate their ideas to each other. In my studio, the drums sound best in the back right corner. The sightlines from this position also allow the drummer to see the entire studio. For bass, I'll typically put the bass amp 1.5 to 2 feet away from the drum kit on the same plane as the front of the kick drum. This position puts the kick and bass phasing together. If possible, I want to keep as many sources on this plane or parallel to it for the least amount of phase cancellation and bleed. Next, I've placed a gobo in front of the drums to further isolate the whole kit from the guitar amp and the keyboards, which are only a few feet in front of the drums. The guitar amp sits right in front of the gobo with a blanket tent over it to add even more isolation. You'll notice the guitar amp, bass amp, and drums are all aimed in the same direction, with most of their microphones aimed in the exact opposite direction. The positioning of both these mics and their sources are intentional, along with the microphone pickup patterns, to maximize isolation and mitigate any phase issues. The keyboards are being monitored through a directional wedge and a combo amp just off to the right of the keys. This was not only the best position for monitoring, it was also the best position for the least amount of bleed into the other sources, as these amps were faced perpendicular to the guitar, bass, and drums. Last, we have the B3. The Leslie, which is the B3 speaker cabinet, was throwing sound in every direction. To properly isolate it, I've close mic'd it and put a gobo in front of it, blocking it from most of the room. The bleed in these mics are actually filling in the room sound and the low end of the recording. For this session, I chose not to mic up anything I could run through a DI box, mainly for isolation purposes and a cleaner overall recording. These direct signals will be completely free of any phase issues or bad bleed. Having the direct signal also gives me the option to reamp any of these sources if I wanted to change their tone or sound at a later time. In my studio, I'm always set up for headphones whether the band is going to use them or not. In a live situation like this, it is our collective preference to not use headphones. When you remove headphones from the equation, the artist can focus on getting a great performance and not have to worry about the typical pressure that comes with recording in a studio. Without headphones, the band instinctively listens to each other in context of the room, and they naturally self-balance. This self-balancing is pivotal to getting a great recording. In a typical tracking session, I record into Pro Tools through my Universal Audio Apollo interfaces, monitoring in UA's console app. Once the band is set up in the live room and writing their first song, I'm dialing in the sounds through my preamps and outboard gear. If I find I need any additional processing, I'll use UA's plugins in console and commit that processing straight into Pro Tools. In console, I'm always recording flat. That means that I'm adjusting levels at the final output of each signal path rather than adjusting at the faders to change the mix. You'll notice that the faders are at unity gain in both console and Pro Tools. It's a misconception that recording flat means that there's no processing happening on the signal path. In a session like this, I'm mixing as I'm recording by committing any processing exactly as I want it into Pro Tools. By recording flat, my starting point will be exactly where I left off when I get into the mixing process. Recording flat also ensures that my recording will translate in any DAW. If I decide to mix outside of Pro Tools or send my tracks to someone else to mix, the session will be infinitely recallable. Let's go through the full signal path of each instrument, and I'll show you how I got these sounds while recording flat. Starting with the drums. The kick drum is mic'd with a Biodynamic M88, which is a hypercardioid dynamic microphone. The M88 is going into a BAE 1073 preamp with the input driven just enough to add some subtle harmonics. After the preamp, I've inserted the Thermionic Culture Vulture in console for even more saturation. For this EP, we really wanted that harmonically rich, wide open kick sound. For the overhead, I used the AEA R84 large ribbon mic with a figure 8 polar pattern. My typical mono overhead position is dead center over the kit, where the kick beater meets the kick drum head, tilted just slightly towards the snare and hi-hat. This mic is basically picking up the ceiling and the drum kit below it and nulling out the sides and most of the room. This is a great mic choice in a live band scenario like this. The R84 is going into a Cappy VP28, which is a 2-stage API style preamp. I've engaged the 80 Hz roll-off button, and then I'm going into an API 550B 4-band EQ. I typically try to capture the full frequency spectrum of a whole kit with an overhead mic. In this instance though, I've used the 550B to sculpt the overhead a little differently by cutting out the subs and some low mids to make room for that massive kick drum and the snare sound we were going for. I've also cut some upper mids and boosted a high shelf to really push those high frequencies into the Studer A800 plugin, which is next in the signal path. Running at 15 IPS was the sweet spot on this song for the Studer to perform its saturation magic. Once I've set the input, the top end I boosted into this plugin with the 550 is now hitting tape and saturating nicely. I'll then dial back the high frequencies on the Repro EQ and the high frequency driver to taste. I also boosted the low frequency Repro EQ to round out the low end I've previously carved out with the 550B. I find EQing into this plugin and then tweaking these parameters yields great results. The snare drum was mic'd from the top using a Beyer M160 double ribbon mic. This mic has a hypercardioid pattern that is great for isolating the snare and taming the hi-hats. The M160 is going into a Cappy 312 preamp. My favorite setup with this combo is to almost dime the input of the 312 and get that snare crunchy, and then attenuate the output until the balance of the kick and snare is what I want it to be for that particular song. The next thing in the snare chain is the UA Transient Designer, which is perfect for matching your drum's attack and decay to the style of the song. For this song, Josh had a towel over the snare, which already made the decay short and deadened the attack. Driving the 312 brought out more sustain in the snare, so I pulled back the sustain and added some of that missing attack that the towel was causing back into the snare using Transient Designer. If you look at the waveform, you can see what the Transient Designer is doing in the recording. For the toms, I've mic'd them both with AKG 414 BXL2s. They are both in cardioid pattern and have a 6 dB pad. There's an 80 Hz roll-off on the rack tom and a 40 Hz roll-off on the floor tom. They're both going into UA 4710 tube preamps with the fast 1176 style compressors engaged. Josh has his toms dialed and tweaks all of his drums differently for almost every song. For this song, he tuned the toms way up and they sounded super cool. I try not to EQ toms unless there's a really offending resonant frequency. I'm ultimately trying to capture the toms how they sound in the room in conjunction with the whole kit. Let's talk about the bass. The bass amp is only there for Alex to monitor. I'm not actually recording the amp, which is great for isolation and the overall recording. I'm not a fan in my room of how bleed sounds into a bass mic. On the other hand, that M88 inside the kick drum is getting great isolation from the bass amp because of the amp being on the same plane as the kick and the mic being hypercardioid. The bass is going directly into a Countryman Type 85 DI. These DIs are very transparent, and in this case, we want our starting point to be the natural sound of Alex's P bass. After the DI, the bass is going into my BAE 1073 preamp. After that, I'm actually rolling off 65 Hz at 12 dB per octave with the Brainworks V3 Mix EQ. It seems crazy to roll off bass, but as you'll hear, the low end is being cumulatively filled back in from the other sources' mics bleeding into each other and picking up the room sound. After the EQ, the bass is going into the UA 1176 Rev A. I have it set to a medium fast attack and a fast release, which is getting me a few dB of gain reduction at a 4:1 ratio. Following the 1176 is the Thermionic Culture Vulture for a little bit of distortion. I have the mix knob dialed way back, so I'm just adding a tiny amount of parallel saturation on the bass. On to the B3. I had two cardioid SM57s miking the Leslie top and a hypercardioid Audio-Technica BP40 miking the drum on the bottom of the Leslie. If I'm stereo miking the top of a Leslie, I'll typically set the mics at a 90-degree angle from each other on the horn side of the cabinet, about an inch off the Leslie, right in front of the louver vents. This configuration seems to best capture the stereo tremolo effect that the Leslie produces, versus just miking the left and right sides. The 257s were going into UA4710 tube preamps with the 1176 style compressors engaged on the fast settings. I then inserted a Fatso plugin in console to add more saturation and even more compression. With the warmth circuit engaged and almost all the way up, the Fatso is softening the high frequencies, much like hitting tape. This high frequency saturation circuit tends to tame any of the harshness that is associated with recording a Leslie. For the Leslie bottom, the BP40 went into my Universal Audio 610 tube preamp. You can see that I've driven the tube gain all the way to +10 and have also driven the input pretty hard as well. I'm using both shelf EQs to shape this bottom mic by boosting at 70 Hz and cutting at 4.5K. B3s can be very dynamic, so I was getting a good 3 to 5 dB of gain reduction through the LA2A style opto compressor. As with anything multi-mic'd, I've adjusted the output to get the blend right with the Leslie top mics. Next we have guitar, which I typically mic about 1 to 2 feet back from the amp. I find putting the mic right up on the cabinet sounds nothing like the actual amp in the room. Josh really has his sounds dialed, so it's important I capture what he's already carefully crafted. I mic the guitar amp with a Beyerdynamic 201, which is another hypercardioid dynamic mic. The 201 is going into a Cappy VP28 preamp with an 80 Hz roll-off and then into an API 550B EQ. For this song, I'm essentially using the EQ to get the guitar to sit in the mix as if I were already mixing it. Josh is playing a Teisco with flat wounds, so the guitar sound is dark to start with. With the 550 EQ, I'm dramatically cutting the sub-frequencies to unmuddy the guitar. I don't want the guitar to sound thin, so I've added some body back into the signal along with a little bit of bite and presence to get those flat wounds to cut through the mix. Next, the guitar is going into an 1176 plugin set at a 4:1 ratio. At a slower attack, the spankiness of the guitar still pokes through and the fast release allows the compressor to quickly get out of the way, keeping the compression sounding natural, just slightly controlling the dynamics by a dB or so. Next we have the Rhodes, which is going through a few effects pedals into a Countryman DI. The DI is then going into a Heritage 1073 preamp. I then had a Culture Vulture inserted in console, but it was in bypass, which means I most likely was using it on one of the 3 other tracks we recorded that day. Last we have the Yamaha YC61 keyboard, which I had labeled Clav DI. The YC61 is going into a Heritage 1073 preamp. I'm pushing the input to get a little saturation and then dialing back the output to taste. I've also engaged the roll-off on the preamp because I don't need a lot of low end in this signal. From the preamp, the signal is going into this 1176 plugin with a pretty fast attack and a fast release at a 4:1 ratio. This sound in particular is like a lead vocal and very dynamic. I was getting about 2 dB of gain reduction and just making the performance a little more steady in the mix. As the band plays out, I hope this video's provided you with some insights and inspired you to try something new. I'd like to say a big thank you to Family Company for letting me pull back the curtain on this session. These guys are all monster musicians doing great things, and I feel very lucky to be tasked with capturing their magic. I've included links to their socials in the description below. Stay tuned for the mixing process in a later video. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like more videos like this, please drop me a line in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.